Law's Bystander initiative, which focuses on criminalization of bystanders and enablers. Professor Guiora is the author of The Crime of Complacency, The Bystanders in the Holocaust, and Armies of Enablers, Survivors, Stories of Complacency and Betrayal in Sexual Assault. And today, Amos will talk about his forthcoming book, Enablers Across the Ages, Normalizing the Unimaginable, with a focus on political enabling throughout history and today. Thank you, Amos, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to all, wherever you are in the world. So in addition to Yotam's gracious introduction, a couple of additional words in terms of how I got to this project examining the role of enablers in society. I'm the only child of two Holocaust survivors. I was raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan, because my father taught at the University of Michigan. And when I was 12 years old, my father took me canoeing. I don't know why canoeing, because my father knew nothing about outdoor sports or anything like that. And he told me, in 1 minute, I will tell you your mother's story. And in 1 minute, I will tell you my story, her Holocaust story and his Holocaust story. And he said, this is the first and last time we will ever have this conversation. And so he told me his story, he told me her story. And I know today that what he told me was a soft sell about his story and a soft sell about her story. But we came home and I had no one to talk to but the family dog. And I said to the dog something I assumed like, whoa, dude, what do we do with this? But my parents meant what they said and said what they meant. There was no discussion of the Holocaust. There was no book about the Holocaust in the house. The word Holocaust was never mentioned in the house. And they were so serious about this when I was a junior at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. My mentor, who was a Gentile, but whose wife, like me, second generation, only child of two Holocaust survivors, said to me, you know, Amos, at some point you need to come to grips with the Holocaust, Judaism, Jewishness, and all that. And I said, great, what the hell do I do? He said, well, go write an honors thesis about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I am not embarrassed or embarrassed, pick your poison, to confess I had no idea what the hell the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was, which says everything you need to know about me. And I came home to my parents, who had great respect for Professor Evans. And I said to my parents, Professor Evans wants me to do an honors thesis on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And my mother looked at my father and said, it's time for dinner. Boom. So they were serious about this. And that's, for better or for worse, that's the tradition I was raised in. And that continued until 10 years ago when I was training for the Salt Lake Marathon, when my running partner, who's not Jewish, said to me, how did this being the Holocaust, happen? How did this happen? And I had a brilliant academic answer, which shows you how incredibly stupid I am, which was, I have no idea. So I came back to my apartment and I said, you know, Dainu, enough is enough. And I became autodidactic on the Holocaust. Obviously, you can't read everything because there's a gazillion books, but quickly became apparent to me there was an issue that had never been addressed through the lens of the law, and that was the role of the bystander in the Holocaust. There have been two great books written about the bystander, one by Hilberg and one by Victoria Barnett, but neither of them had addressed the role of the legal aspect of the bystander. And I ended up writing the book that Yotam referenced, The Crime of Complicity, The Bystander in the Holocaust. And I looked at both of my parents, his experience and her experience, through the lens of the bystander. For me, the bystander is the person who stands by and sees harm and doesn't involve themselves for whatever reasons. And that really became a focal point for me, the person who's there when harm occurs. 5 or 6 years ago, after that book came out, translated into Dutch, translated into Chinese, I've given lectures worldwide on the book. It's been used in courses. My publishers, the American Bar Association, said to me, okay, fine, what's next? I said, I'm done. You know, I learned about my parents, and I finally did. By the way, I did learn that what my father told me when I was 12 was not really that accurate deliberately. What he told me about his mom, about my mom, also not accurate deliberately to spare me. And then I wrote the other book that Yotam mentioned, The Armies of Enablers, which looks at something different, which builds off the bystander. That's the enabler, which will be ultimately the point of this conversation. The enabler is not physically present, but the enabler is a person in a position of authority who knows of harm or should know of harm. And that indeed led to the book, The Armies of Enablers, which I interacted with people from victims, survivors, from Michigan State University, USA Gymnastics, Catholic Church, Ohio State University. I finished that, and a book that just came out now is about a 12-year-old boy who was killed by his teacher, principal pedophile. Again, he had been enabled for 30 years by enablers. That has led to me where the book that we're going to talk about now, which looks at exactly enablers across the ages, normalizing the unimaginable. Because for me, whether historically I look at the Holocaust or I look at Israel today, I split my time between Salt Lake City and Jerusalem. We live outside Jerusalem. For me, I've at least convinced myself that all roads run through the enabler. We can sit here and talk about the perpetrator until, your Tom's hair looks like my hair. But unless we understand the ecosystem of enabling, which is what this is all about, we will not progress in any way. So when I look at the Holocaust or in Israel, I mean, you don't have to agree politically, which is fine. But the question is, how is it that why are we where we are? And for me, with all due respect to the perpetrator, for me, we are where we are because of what I call the ecosystem of enabling. Give credit where credit is due. The term ecosystem of enabling is not mine. It's from one of my research assistants, for which I'm very grateful. But I've really adopted that term, giving credit, obviously, to the student because I think it's absolutely correct. So the question is, what does society do when it understands that there is harm occurring and that the leader or leaders or whoever is in charge is protected by this ecosystem by the enablers? And that's exactly, from my perspective, and I work on this with legislators around the world, that to understand the issue, we need to understand, recognize that the enabler is the person who in many ways is responsible for the harm and that they must bear consequences for that harm, which is why I work, as I say, with legislators to hold enablers accountable. Because I teach law and I view things through the lens of the law. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm just a modest law professor. For me, it's all about criminalizing the enabler. Because I genuinely believe that because of the harm that enablers enable, bad English, and the consequences of their actions, it's necessary to view this through the lens of the law. And the only way I know to view things through the lens of the law, because I perhaps also teach criminal procedure, is the act of criminalizing the enabler. So over the course of the past, by now maybe 8-10 years, I worked with legislators also on the criminalizing the bystander. They've had success. Criminalizing the enabler have yet to have success, which is okay because it's a process. I understand that. But I genuinely believe if we're going to really try to unpack why harm occurs, yes, there's the perpetrator, but the perpetrator knows that he or she can act with impunity or immunity because they know that they will be protected. And so, for better or for worse, I've convinced myself that the harm caused by the perpetrator, I leave that to other scholars, and I don't involve myself in that whatsoever. My sole focus is a polite word, obsession is probably more accurate, is indeed the role of the enabler. And so the book I'm working on now, building off the previous book, looking historically and contemporary, makes the argument that to really address harm to individuals, I mean, real harm, not abstract harm, not ephemeral harm, but concrete harm, we need to understand that there's a need to hold the enabler liable, because without the enabler, the perpetrator doesn't act. Or if he does act, he knows that he's not protected. And it's that wall. And going back to the previous book, the armies of enablers was not my term. It came from one of the women who I interviewed, who was an athlete at Michigan State. I talked about army, like singular. And she was exasperated with me and said, no, it's not army, it's armies, because wherever I as a survivor, wherever I turn, tuck, 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 the perpetrator was protected by army here, army here, army here, army here, which makes it armies. And that's why I really do believe that it's not a singular enabler, it's plural enablers. There are different levels of enablers, as I write in the book. There's view this through the lens of concentric circles, inner circle, outer, outer. But they all, whether they're here, they're all doing ultimately at the end of the day the same thing, which is protecting they're doing two things. They're protecting the perpetrator and they're causing harm. And there are obviously clear instances of harm. And for me, that is essential to have this discussion. And hence, Sharon, I'm so grateful to you and to you, Tom, for giving me this opportunity to talk about this, because I think that we have no choice today but to ask ourselves, why is it that we are where we are? And as someone who lives in both places and wakes up, as you, Tom, knows, probably at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is noon in Israel, because that's when I start getting the news feed, I view everything through the lens of the enabler. And that's why I'm delighted to have this uncomfortable conversation. And Sharon, Tom, I turn it back to you. Questions, anxieties, concerns, but genuinely thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Amos, for joining us. Thank you for your opening remarks. Before that, I'll remind that we have a Q&A options. If there are any questions that people have throughout this webinar, they can ask them and we will refer to them at the end of the talk. Now, a question for you, Amos, which might sound a bit silly, but I'm sure you'll have a very found answer, is why do people prefer to be bystanders and enablers? Why is inaction preferable to action, even, even though the answer beyond it's
No,
easier
it's
to do?
actually it's an excellent question. And as I told you earlier, I'm not a psychologist, anthropologist, sociologist. I'm the law professor. But having, by now spoken to a wide range of people, including psychologists, sociologists, right? There are different theories, and this is in no particular order. And we can play around with the order, we can add different suggestions. The bystander, the person who's physically there, I think, I begin with myself. I've been a bystander, I think 3 times when there was harm. And I once acted, yay for me. I think saved someone's life. And there were a couple instances where I walked away. Once in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a football game, there was a homeless gentleman who was attacked by a college student, and I was, running to the game, and I just was with a friend of mine, and we probably said to each other, "What is that dude doing?" And we continued in our way because we couldn't be late for the game. What's my rationalization for myself, my justification for myself? Had to get to the game. Priorities. That's very clear. I'm sure lots of people have been in that situation. The other time, when I was home in Jerusalem, and the kid across the street was screaming in the middle of the night. I mean, kids cry, but this kid was screaming, and call the police. Not call the police. And at the end of the day, he didn't call the police. And later found out that his dad had locked him out of this. There's a little boy. That his dad had locked him out of the house in the middle of the night deliberately. Why didn't I call the police, Tom? I ain't got no explanation other than I didn't. And the one time I did save someone's life because I had worked in an emergency room and I had, basic sense of what to do, and I acted. But I don't have any explanation for the other two, which goes to your question. And I've written about it. I've been very honest about my failure. And by the way, I would prosecute me today based on laws that are here in Utah based on my book. With respect to the enabler or enablers, the failure to act in no particular order. One, because enablers, people in positions of in institutional authority, have an identification with the institution, wherever institutional affiliation. Two, some people are very uncomfortable being the perpetual, proverbial whistleblower. Some people view this through the lens of their pocketbook, which I understand. If they call someone out, will they be financially impacted? Fear of repercussion, call it. When I interviewed the women athletes from the Olympics, it's in the book, so I can share this. We talked about this. Why was the team doctor, Dr. Nasser, enabled by enablers? And one of the athletes was very, very open about this. And I think it's uncomfortable, but this whole conversation is uncomfortable. She said a lot of the enablers are jealous of us. I mean, Olympic athletes are just different from the rest of us. They're incredible athletes, for all the obvious reasons. And she thought that in part because this is her speaking, we're not particularly likable. The whole world revolves around us. We are Olympic athletes. We are the top. And she felt that the combination of the athletes, we are unlikable, and there's a lot of jealousy with respect to athletes, elite athletes. She was very insistent that I include that in the book, which I did include that in the book. I think the fifth reason is some people are apathetic, but I do think that this notion of institutional affiliation, institutional identification, which leads to institutional complicity, I think that plays a role in it. And I do think that also the pocketbook, the so-called whistleblower, and I think those are, I think to your question, Tom, which is a great way to begin discussion, it's and/or. And I think some people also perceive that their self-interest is enhanced perhaps by identification with the perpetrator for a variety of reasons. Maybe they see benefit to it. Maybe they feel that they benefit from the harm caused, what I perceive as harm. Maybe they don't perceive as harm, and they perhaps align with the perpetrator. So I think probably those 6 or 7 are at least not empirical, because I'm not an empiricist, but I think that is a fair reflection or fair accumulation of the different theories out there.
So the way you describe it, and especially your own personal experience, which I really appreciate you sharing, and also giving your professional point of view of you would persecute yourself.
Prosecute. I don't know. I leave persecution to others. I would prosecute.
No, prosecute. I'm sorry. Not enough coffee this morning. But I do have a question for you. So it's interesting because I lived in a community village in Israel, for example, that the person who handled the money was eventually charged, trialed, and sent to jail over embezzlement. And this community, everybody knew he was embezzling, and they were just looking the other way. Among the elders of that community, they said, well, he's doing all that hard work, he deserves to have a hand in the pot. And it wasn't, they didn't fill the pot. It was the younger family who filled up the pot. So I'm wondering whether there's a slight, first of all, whether there's a slight difference in terms of terminology between enablers and, sitting on the fence, kind of not really inquiring, not really aware of what's going on. And whether this is something that you would see more as you described with the Nasser trial and what came out from that, there's something that is connected specifically to a group or an organization or kind of a society.
I think so. I begin with Nasser, who was the team doctor at Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics. The enablers were the coaches, trainers, doctors at Michigan State and USA Gymnastics. Because it's in the book by name. Obviously, some people's names I didn't use, but this person's name is in the book at her request. Lindsay Lemke, who was the captain of Michigan State's women's gymnastics team. She had been assaulted by Nasser beginning in high school. And when she was the senior, she's 2021, she's the captain of Michigan State's team. She goes to the coach and says, I'm done. I can't deal with this anymore. I'm going to the police. And her coach, Kathy Klagas, says to her 3 sentences, which goes right to your point, Sholem. She says, 1, I want you to think about how this will impact Larry and his family. No, irrelevant. 2, if you go to the police, I'll have to talk to your parents. No, Ms. Lemke is a 21-year-old adult. And 3 is the worst. She said to Lemke, I remind you, athletic scholarships are given and scholarships are taken. So that's a direct threat. That is as much of a threat as threat can be threatened. By the way, Klagas ended up in jail, not because of this, because she had perjured herself to the FBI. By the way, anybody who's listening, don't perjure yourself to the FBI, because she went to jail. But that's a classic enabler. And the other excellent example, excellent in quotations, of course, is Tiffany Thomas today, who played softball at Michigan State, and she was assaulted by Nasser 150 times. And on a Thursday evening, she had had enough, Dianu. And she met with the team trainer, a woman, and she did on this woman's body what Nasser was doing to her body. And the trainer's response was, oh my God, this is awful. Well, of course it's awful. She said, you need to go talk to the head trainer, also another woman. And she went to her by herself. She didn't go with her. She sent Tiffany by herself to meet with the head trainer, who then the trainer, met with the coach, and together they manipulated to have Tiffany removed from the team. So those are conscious, deliberate actions by 3 different enablers: the trainer, coach, in which the survivor, again, some people call themselves survivors, some call themselves victims, whatever term is request, in which the enabler, the 3 of them clearly protected Nasser. And I take you back to Lemke's term, the armies of enablers, wherever Tiffany turned, right? And that's a pattern that repeats itself. With respect to, people sitting on the fence, so where you grew up, I don't know enough, but the enablers who I write about are people who are in a position of authority to act. Trainers, doctors, officials, politicians who can do something proactive, or they can react proactively. But from my perspective, sitting on the fence, from the perspective of the survivor or victim, is awful. One of the people who I spent significant time with, Maddie Larson, who was an elite gymnast. I asked her two questions, which goes to your point, Sholan. I asked her, what were your expectations of the enablers, the officials from USA Gymnastics? And her answer was pretty clear. I expected to be protected. And the follow-up question was, okay, and now that you weren't protected, because Maddie Larson, was sexually violated by Larry Nassar 750 times. And so I said to Maddie, I said, okay, what's the consequence of not being protected? And one word I gave her, and the answer was obvious: abandonment. And so even those who sit on the fence and those who don't do, they are abandoning the survivor victim. In the case of embezzlement, I mean, I don't know if it was a moshav or kibbutz. I mean, you people were losing money, right? And the consequence of sitting on the fence, especially if you know that the harm is there and not acting, there are direct consequences or significant consequences. In your case, it's embezzlement. In other cases, it's significant injury. I mean, 750 times being sexually violated is, there are no words. And I think today, whether we look at the Holocaust or contemporary society, the consequences of the enabler not acting, they are, with all due respect to embezzlement, it goes well beyond embezzlement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amos.
Yeah.
So a forward question that would be that you've discussed both, the Holocaust and situations that happen today. So I would ask, what would be the difference between, how the enablers' roles in some way have changed over time, and how in the past and how today that affects both bystanders, enablers, and victims, and how it changed.
I think as I sit here in my office writing this book, right, which addresses many ways what you just asked, the enablers in the Holocaust, I think about my grandparents who were murdered in Auschwitz on May 26, 1944, or my mother, who was the Budapest version of Anne Frank, hiding in the attic with my grandmother. That doesn't happen, obviously, without, Hitler and friends. Doesn't happen without Eichmann in Budapest. But I remind that Eichmann came to Budapest with, a cadre of maybe 20 German officers, because they knew that they could rely not only on the Arrow Cross, but on the Hungarian population to do their bidding. And it's not by chance that from May 44 till July 44, 450,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered in Auschwitz. I mean, the efficiency is just extraordinary. But the efficiency, to your question, Tom, owes a thank you, it's sarcastic as can be, right, to the Hungarian population that participated, collaborated, enabled. So that's as direct as harm as can be. In terms of contemporary society, as I'm writing in the book, and obviously we don't have to agree, which is fine. When I look at enablers today in Israeli society, and I've made the decision in the book to call people out by name, unlike in the Holocaust enablers, which I don't call by name, but in Israeli politics today, Israeli society today, I've made the decision to call people out by name who are, from my perspective, again, don't have to agree, but October 7th doesn't happen without enablers. And where are we today? September 15th, 16th? As we're almost into the year of October 7th. The past 11 plus months, 11 months and 1 week, doesn't happen without enablers. And where we go from here, your guess is as good as mine. But because I see direct harm, direct consequences, both here and here, it's back to what I said earlier, Tom. It's the reason that I genuinely believe that enablers need to be viewed through the lens of the law, and not only through the lens of morality and ethics, which is not my bailiwick, but I really do believe that there's a need to understand that there are consequences. And obviously, I assume, like anybody who's listening and watching, that for me, when the news of the 6 hostages who were murdered, I view that obviously through the lens of Hamas, obviously, but also, how is it that we're here, and why are they still being held? And that goes back to how Sharon introduced this wonderful organization with respect to the hostages. I mean, I confess, I view literally everything through the lens of the hostages. And if I may add on a personal note, We were laughing before, right, about Hapoel Yerushalayim, Hapoel Jerusalem, the basketball team. So I never met Hirsch. But Hirsch, like my two sons and I are fans of Hapoel Jerusalem basketball. My kid went to the funeral. And that kind of intimacy, I think, plays a role in this also. Again, I want to emphasize, I never met Hirsch. I've never met his parents. But that the connection of Hapoel and other connections that other people have makes us, if you will, as any Israeli knows, intimate and personal.
You said just a minute ago that enablers should be persecuted by law. Prosecuted. I'm sorry. Yes, prosecuted.
So,
I'm sorry.
Maybe there are those who want to persecute them. I'll go with prosecuting.
No. I know what I want to say, and then I go and say something completely different. So yes, thank goodness I didn't say celebrated. So yes, they need to be trialed, prosecuted by law. They have to be viewed in that manner. But when we're talking about political enablers, now, whether they are anywhere on the planet, they can be in Israel, they could be in India, they could be in Germany, they can be in the United States, anywhere on the planet. Sometimes legal action cannot be taken. Legislation won't be legislated. We are looking at a different lens, a lens of morality. And so I would like to hear your view of that.
So I get the question, but I need to give 2 sentences of background. From 94 to 97, I served as the IDF's legal advisor to the Gaza Strip. And in that context, for a year and a half, I don't remember, I apologize. The commander of the IDF in Gaza was today's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and I served as Yoav's legal advisor. A year and a half ago, I gave a talk on enablers at the Weizmann Institute. And I gave the talk with my good friend, Professor Avner Deshalit, who's a professor of political philosophy at the Hebrew University. And somebody who heard the talk and knew that I'd been Gallant's legal advisor, asked me if I would be willing to have part of my talk excerpted, because people were protesting outside Gallant's house at the time, and to have what we had written read at his house. I said, what a great honor, and tell him that it's coming from me. And they stood there outside with megaphones. Amos Guiora says, kacha, kacha, v'kacha, right? And I think in that talk with Professor Deshalit, I think we focus more, to your point, on the morality and the ethics of it. This is before October the 7th. Because I do believe that if you are in a position, this was also both before and after Netanyahu tried to fire Gallant, right? Because I think if you're in a position of power, Minister of Defense, and you know that harm is being done that is perhaps preventable, then you have a clear obligation to act, unrelated to the law. And sitting in the cabinet, whether you're the head of the ISA, the Israel Security Agency, Ronen Bar, or you're the Ramatkal Herzl Halevi, or you're Rosh Mossad Barnea, or the Minister of Defense Gallant, and every leak tells you that they disagree with literally every decision that's been made since the 7th of October. And I haven't communicated with Gallant, Barnea, or Herzl Halevi. I try to communicate with Avi Dichter, who I've known for years. And by being there, to what extent Netanyahu engaged with them, open question, but they're leaking all the time. They're leaking about the hostages, and they're leaking about the Philadelphia corridor. Tells me that they are extremely, being polite here, uncomfortable with the manner in which this is being handled. At some point, not legally, to your point, Shalom, morally, when do you raise your hand and say, I can't be a participant in this? I know. And what they say, because I, as you know, I'm writing this book and I've engaged with a wide range of people. And I'm told that the reason that for instance, Herzl Halevi and Bao don't resign is because they're deeply concerned that Netanyahu will replace them with somebody like Ben Gvir, right? Some kind of a, and we all know what that means. So they maybe have convinced themselves they have to ride out the storm. Maybe there'll be elections, and we can all take a breath. But at some point, you're there, you're in the room, and again, not to your question, which I understand it. It's a great question. At some point, you are complicit. You want to go down the road of the law? We won't go down the road of the law, but the 6 hostages who were murdered, we can ask ourselves, considering that 3 of them, I think I'm right, 3 of them were on the list to be released either in May or July, and they weren't. And it's pretty clear if you follow the leaks from DC or from Jerusalem or from Tel Aviv, the reason they weren't released is because the prime minister, at the last moment added a twist to the deal that had been agreed on. And if you're in the room, if you're a Galant Bear Bavnea Herzl Levy, but when do you say, I see myself as complicit and I'm doing much of what on last week, the head of the intelligence unit has resigned. The head of the military intelligence, what's his name? Shit, I can't remember. Resigned also. Now, did they resign because they felt guilty? I don't know. Did they feel because they say that they had so screwed up? I don't know. But they at least stood up and said, "I'm out." These other guys, the head of the Central Command, but that's a different story. We could have a long conversation about that one. But these other guys are in the room. Guns, in, out, Eisenkot, that's a different story. But to your question, Sharon, which is a great question, at what point morally do you have the obligation to say, yes, I'm going to give up being the head of this, and it could be that he'll put in somebody, somebody like Ben Gvir to be the head of Shabak, and there'll be a disaster. Fine. But at one point, do you have the responsibility morally to say that I will no longer be complicit? It's a great question. It's another book, Sharon, not this one, but it's a great, great question.
I'll be honored to help you write it. I'm kidding.
That way we can meet. No, but it's an excellent question. I think it's so, when I reached out after the talk in March, a year and a half ago, not important how, I didn't quite understand the reverse engineering. I got Dichter's cell number and I wrote Avi. I've known him for years. I wrote, Avi, the 2 of us are children of Holocaust survivors. And I know your values because we worked together when you were the head of the ISA in the South, and I was the legal advisor. We've spent time together, values, norms, culture, and you're complicit. I think I even used that word. And when will you raise your hand and say, I no longer want to be attached to this? But I also know from everything I read and, I talk to people, perhaps Dichter and the others also have an agenda that goes beyond this in which they think it serves their purpose, which obviously is something that he wants to be prime minister and he wants to be prime minister and he wants to be prime minister. That's something that I just don't understand. But maybe that's why I'm not in politics, Sharon, or rather I sit in this office.
Interesting.
So the next question to follow would be more of the how and less of the why, which is when people decide they don't want to be, enablers and complicit, how do they actually, but what motivates them, first of all, to take action, and what would motivate, to convince probably others to take action, and how do they motivate them to bring this change that is necessary to stop?
So when I was home from over the summer meeting with an endless list of people who I'm very grateful to, many of them told me.
But just so the viewers know that home for you is Israel.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, so
Thank you. I appreciate it. We live outside. We live in Mevaseret outside Jerusalem. Thank you. Exactly. A number of them told me that they know that politician A, politician B, politician C, politician D is willing to flip and raise his or her hand in favor of a vote of no confidence. But 1, 2, 3, 4 say, I will do so only if this person also does it. Now, I know that this person wants to raise their hand, but this person won't raise their hand alone, and this person won't raise their hand alone, and this person, we can only do it, as a gush, as a block. So is that fear of what in American politics we call fear of the base? Is that political expediency? Is that political self-interest? Is that putting my goals or my ambitions above the fate of the hostages? I mean, if you listen carefully to what the hostage families are saying, and I don't know how much of this is being translated into English, but and I apologize, I can't pronounce her last name. Einav, who's the mother of the hostage Matan. I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
I'll probably massacre it, and I apologize, but it's Sangekel.
Singaukel.
Sangekel. Sangekel.
Singaukel.
Yeah, it's a beautiful name.
She said last Saturday night, in referring to the prime minister, she won't reference his name, won't use his name. She calls him the hangman from Gaza Street. Gaza Street, those who don't know, is where the prime minister's residence is. If you're one of the enablers of Netanyahu and you hear a hostage mother refer to the prime minister as a hangman who lives on Gaza Street, I mean, what else do you need to give you a kick in the rear to raise your hand? And I don't know which hostage family said it, either beginning of last week, I don't think last night. The prime minister wants to receive the hostages in a bag. I mean, I think it was Khalid Gatz's family who said that. I think maybe it was another family. Those are beyond damning words. And if you're in the coalition and you hear Einav or you hear another family, or the Shiva, the condolence visit, Netanyahu and his wife to Mishpachat Danino, and the father and the brother put it straight in his face. The father, who's a rabbi, said to him, "My son was murdered in a tunnel that you paid for." What else, if you're Yoav Gallant or Avi Dichter or any of these others, what else do you need to propel you into action? And then when Netanyahu did the usual thing, said, come from a bereaved family, my brother in Entebbe, and my brother in Entebbe, and the Nino's brother, the fallen, murdered hostage's brother, said to him, it's all recorded, you can read the transcript of the recording, said, stop with this. Every time people confront you with this, you go talk about your brother. Yoni Netanyahu was killed in Entebbe, a hero's hero, 100%. There's no connection between this and this.
Releasing hostages.
Oh, hang on. And there's the huge bumper stickers, which I've seen in Kaplan, right? With Netanyahu, with Bibi's picture and with Yoni's picture. Yoni Netanyahu, under his picture, it says, sacrificed himself to save hostages. Under Bibi's picture, it says sacrificed hostages to save himself. That's right. You're any of the people who I name in the book, and you hear this. I mean, if I, sitting in Salt Lake City, read the transcript, then you also read the transcript, right? Because it's been released. What are you waiting for? And you therefore, Sharon, this goes back to your question. I focus on the law, but I think it's a great point you make. It certainly makes yourself morally complicit. I have a friend who we'll call Joe, okay? Obviously, Yossi, but lo Yossi, who served as a commander of Nir Barkat. And he stands outside his house with a megaphone and says, I was your commander. I know your values. And, personal ambition is a great thing. We're all ambitious. That's great. But not when hostages are being murdered. And that's why, for me, there's a cost to this, consequences. And by the way, if I just maybe combining, I don't know how much play this has gotten in America. I mean, there's things you quote unquote can't make up. So, Yotam, we were talking about this before we went on the show. The three protesters who laid the flyers in the synagogue in Herzliya and then were subject to 8 hours of interrogation by the police.
3 women.
So, 3 women of my generation, polite way of saying my age, right? 8-hour interrogation? Okay, they put the flyers. By the way, those of who don't know, a synagogue in Israel is public property. To low poets into a synagogue because the door's open. It's paid for. I pay for the synagogue, public property, and they put flyers for that. You interrogate them for 8 hours, and sure, the minister of state security, whatever the title is, of Itamar Ben-Gvir. So he's out here. But those same enablers know that 3 women my age were interrogated for 8 hours for putting a flyer of hostage pictures on the seats in a synagogue and you keep quiet, that is the essence of complicity. And just unconscionable.
Especially the members of that synagogue, people who attend that synagogue on a regular basis, good people, honest people, know that this has happened and are keeping quiet about it. Sorry, I don't want to pour any more fuel into the fire. It's just outraging. Yotam, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries. We have 3 questions from the Q&A.
Please.
So one of them's Paul asks, what about those who elect the malicious rulers? Are they enablers legally?
So it is. I understand the question, and I get the question. I
want to interject, and I usually don't do that when you start talking. It's impolite, but I do want to say something, because in the political arena, in a democracy, you'll always have those who disagree with the government. And statements like this can come from either side. So we have to be conscientious of how to, there's, I know what is morally right, but I can find myself with someone who disagree with me completely politically, and they think that whoever is the decision maker is 100% right, and they have the law on their side, and there's nothing immoral about their decision. So I'm just putting it out there because it's important to consider that.
I understand the question. So because my ultimate focus to the question is who is prosecutable, and in the context of prosecutorial discretion, when I write about prosecuting, I mean, like, an indictment, ktav ishum. You can't prosecute the entire populace. And for me, it's all about the individual. In the same way that in the book about the athletes, I named specific individuals. I didn't name all of Michigan State. I named the coaches, trainers, doctors. And here, sure, I mean, in a democracy, thank God, you can go vote. You can vote this way. You can vote that way. I can feel this way. I can feel that way. But for me, it's the people who I hold most directly responsible for what I define as harm. So for me, in terms of those who can most dramatically impact now the course of history, it's those, again, those same individuals who I call out in the book. The population as a whole, that's too expansive, and there's it's hard enough to get legislators to focus on enablers of specific individuals. No legislature would prosecute or would criminalize an entire population group. That's just not, in the world in which I live in, that's just not feasible, nor would that meet any kind of legal test about arbitrary and capricious legislation.
Mm-hmm. And a second, probably a follow-up question would be that I'll ask is, enablers are many. How will you able to make them liable in the democratic system, especially in a marginal one? Especially
in
a marginal one.
So in the book, thanks to my extraordinary team of research assistants who get the shout out, we've created, they have created concentric circles of enablers, most intimate, zoom in, zoom out. And because I have spent enough time with prosecutors and with legislators, I know that the definition has to be really tight, and the identification of who is prosecutable has to be really tight, because otherwise the chances of success are minimal at best. It's hard enough as it is. There's also a long discussion in jurisprudence whether enabling is a crime of omission or a crime of commission. I perceive it as a crime of commission, but because it's you're deciding not to act. To make it viable legislatively and to make it viable legally, it has to be a small group of individuals, because otherwise no legislature, much less no prosecutor, would quote unquote carry the ball. And what is not only important is the definition, which has to be airtight, but you have to make it as specific as possible in the context not only of the definition but its implementation, which would go to the harm that the enablers cause. And in the context of Israel today, the definition obviously would be tight and who falls into the category would be tight. I also, trust me, I well understand, obviously, that the whole notion of when, if and when, comma, you can prosecute politicians. Obviously, there'll obviously be questions of immunity, which I understand, which is an important issue. But in terms of the question, it's very specific with respect to the individual and very specific with respect to the harm they cause. This is not abstract, and this is not abstract.
We agreed that there's a challenge in prosecuting or using a legal frame to pin down enablers of a regime or of a political leadership that is ethically wrongdoing. Okay, let's put it in a mild terms. I wonder, how do we find ourselves in situations that we have an external court handling persecutions and acknowledging the term that was used by one of our attendees, malicious leaders or malicious rulers, like what happened with the former president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, who, you know, he was not just overthrown, he was also being prosecuted by
In The Hague.
In The Hague as an external court outside of the country. It was more of an international court.
Sure.
So I'm just wondering, is that something that could be promoted one way or another, or is that a conversation that is really something that is like a hot potato? We shouldn't even discuss this for all sorts
I think
of reasons.
it's a very pertinent question, because the international judiciary, ICC, ICJ, which Israel is not signatory to, neither is the United States. By law, if the nation state's judiciary is non-functioning, then the ICC, ICJ can intervene, which is what happened with Milosevic. So now that there's talk about arrest warrants for Gallant and for Netanyahu, those are with respect to, we have a long discussion about that too, but the accusation of war crimes in Gaza. Whether the arrest warrants will ultimately really, you know, A, be issued, and B, you know, your guess is as good as mine. I don't see their implementation, because I don't, first of all, Netanyahu and Gallant aren't going to travel to Europe. And when they come to the United States of America, you know, they won't be arrested. But it's out there. I mean, there is this sense with respect to the way in which the IDF is conducting the no longer war. I don't even know what the hell to call it in Gaza today, the conflict in Gaza, whatever it is. Three of us well know there's a significant amount of public criticism of it, and that is what has served as the impetus for the issuance of the arrest warrants. But I don't see any practical implementation of it. And I get the noise, I get the publicity, I get the public positioning of it. I mean, you know, fine. Does it have any practical import? No. And I seriously doubt that Gallant wakes up, or the Herzl Levy, or the head of the IDF in the Southern Command wakes up in the morning and says, what about the ICC, ICJ? But I think that from a public positioning of how Israel is perceived in the world today, I think that probably does have impact, because I think there is, in many quarters, discomfort about the nature of it. And we haven't even discussed, and that's another conversation, you know, Lebanon to where, the West Bank to where. And I just saw a few hours ago that the Houthis again fired missiles, or a missile or two missiles that landed near the airport. You know, the last time the Houthis fired missiles, the IDF attacked Yemen. That's also out there. And not to mention that the IDF, or the Israel, attacks in Syria, and the IDF clearly attacks in Iran. Those questions in terms of the internationalization of the conflict and how the international community perceives Israel, I think, Sharon, you're 100% right. That is very much out there. And I think if you were asking me, if Secretary of State Blinken were here in my office, I imagine that one of the reasons that he's so deeply concerned about Netanyahu is not only because of of Gaza, but I think Blinken, I think he genuinely cares about Israel, and I think he genuinely is concerned about the internet increased international condemnation of Israel. This is not some mere passing fancy. This has potentially very significant impacts, and I don't know to what extent Netanyahu and those in his immediate milieu genuinely understand that. I think Blinken sees himself as, in essence, raising that not the orange flag, right, the red flag of stop. It's not an orange flag; it's a red flag, and it's why also the United States occasionally makes noise about arms embargo and about banning this person and banning this person. I mean, I think Blinken, Biden well understand, without getting into Harris in the election campaign, but I think Blinken, Biden well understand how all of this may well impact Israel, not only tactically, but strategically moving ahead.
I just want to add a couple of things which I think are impertinent for this conversation, especially because it is recorded and we will be sharing this. First of all, I personally feel, many do the same, that the ICC and ICJ been always, and the world in generally, always have been overly judging Israel beyond what is grounded with facts and the truths. And it's motivated by anti-Semitism. And I do want to be very, very clear about that, even though, despite the fact that I have significant disagreements with the policies Israel has in place for the West Bank and for Gaza. So, it's not an excuse, but it is the basis for a lot of things that anti-Semitism have been motivating how Israel has been criticized. So this is one thing I want to add. Another thing is, most of the Jews, whether they're Israelis or diaspora Jews that I interact with, care deeply about Israel. They care deeply about the future of Israel and the future of the people of Israel and the Jewish people around the world, the future. And the reason why we're doing these kinds of webinars and these kind of conversations, and one of the reasons why we're doing all these initiatives at Hope for Israel Alliance and other grassroots movements, because we see that these two entities, diaspora, Jews, and Israel, are entwined. And we're in a specific pivotal moment where Israel was attacked. Israel's immediate retaliation was criticized due to anti-Semitism. There is a huge wave of anti-Semitism across the world, all sorts of expressions on campuses and whatnot that we see. And on top of everything, internally in Israel, there is currently a government that is not in favor of the people that they lead. They're not putting the country's best interest ahead of them. And they are, in our view, putting in jeopardy not only the state of Israel's future, but also the diaspora Jews' future, also in jeopardy. So this is where our deep concern comes from. And now that we have another 101 hostages in Israel, we really feel that morally abandoning them, not doing anything in our power to get them freed alive is a moron. You said abandoning the victim. You used that term earlier. So enabling, basically, the bottom line is, enabling means abandoning the victim, whether they are hostages or a child or an athlete or anyone who's been maliciously handled and of course illegally. So the talk today was very illuminating. And it's very challenging for a lot of people to hear this kind of conversation and to think about themselves as enablers. So we have another question for you.
Please.
Yotam, do you want to ask the question?
There's another extra
Oh,
Q&A
sorry, I
question.
missed. Yeah, because I was okay.
Yes. So maybe let's run through that and then we'll summarize. Sorry about that, Sharon. Mark asks, can you reflect upon the concern, particularly American, about the fear of legal retribution, civil or criminal, particularly with modern society's searching for 2020 hindsight and or lack of bulletproof statutory protections? See NYC Daniel Penny case or many other of lesser media exposure.
So thank you, Mark. It'd be helpful. Sharon, can you put my email in the link? And Mark, if I can ask you, please, to send me the cases that you referenced, I'd be much appreciative. Thank you.
I'll take care of it.
With respect to, I mean, you know, I don't know if you're a football fan, right? Hindsight 2020 vision, Monday morning quarterbacking and all that. My concern, and this maybe I think goes to Sharon's very poignant comments. When I'm writing this book, your question is spot on to what we were working on this morning. When I write about the Holocaust today, I write it, it's not exactly the right word, but far more scholarly than personal. When I wrote the book, The Crime of Complicity, the Bystander in the Holocaust 10 years ago, which was the first time I'd written about the Holocaust through the lens of my parents, it was, I think, a combination of personal and scholarly, perhaps more on the personal than on the scholarly, because Mark, I'm not a Holocaust scholar. And when I write about Israel today, as I told Sharon, and Yotam has been with me in demonstrations, right? I demonstrate, I demonstrate and I go home to our house and I write about the demonstration. So that's more, it's also scholarly because at the end of the day, there's scholarship here, but it's coming from here because I'm participating in the marches, the rallies, demonstrations. I could also show you pictures of my car that has been vandalized more times than I care to remember because I have particular stickers on my car. I've also been the subject of I'll spare you the words, of words that are just beyond outrageous about what I have been called. So as my family also, but that's okay. That's the give and take in Israel. So this is no 2020 hindsight. This is in the moment. With respect to the looking back, I think you're right, and it would be for me the Holocaust, which is also the reason I've decided in writing about the enablers in the Holocaust, I'm not calling anybody out by name, unlike the enablers in Israeli society, which I absolutely am calling out by name. And I've said this to you in the past hour, two of whom I've worked with and I know. But I think that for the reader, whether, and obviously I assume the oldest person here, I've reached a stage in life where if people agree with me or disagree with me, sei gesund. What's important for me is to have the conversation. And Sharon's right. This is an uncomfortable conversation. I won't share with you emails I get. Some supportive and some like you have to scratch I don't have any hair to scratch, but you scratch your head. Well, what people write me, I mean, it's vile, but that's okay. It means that I'm, making them think and probably irritating them, which is why, for me, when I view this question of the enablers through the ages, because I really do find them at fault as an Israeli, I find them at fault where we are today, without any doubt. With respect to the Holocaust, again, not a Holocaust historian. I've obviously read a lot, written about it. Not a Holocaust historian. As someone who lives, breathes Israel today, who lives in Israel, whose family lives in Israel, who participates, it's a combination. Maybe this is the best answer to your question, Mark. It's a combination of visceral and scholarship, or scholarship and visceral. And I confess it's deeply personal because, when Yotam knows this, I did the march, the 4-day march with the families. I did 2 of the 4 days, and I met I briefly chatted with her. And you meet with a hostage parent, It's not abstract. It's there is, I've got 3 kids, 3 grandchildren. I can't even imagine what it's like to be. None of us can imagine what it's like to be them. Cannot. And that's, Mark, why for me it's that combination. And it's not 2020. It's in the moment. But if you could, I saw that you all got my email. If you could send me links to what you referenced, I'd be much obliged. Thank you.
I just put in your email address
Thank
in
you.
the box, in the chat box. Everybody can look at
Thank you
that
so
up.
much.
You can reach out personally, directly to Professor Amos Guiora.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you being so accessible.
Thank you.
We talked about a lot of things, and I just to remind, us having this conversation and everybody else online that, some of us are based here in North America. Some of us are in Israel. Some of us are in North America and our hearts are in Israel, and or anywhere else on the planet. We are all over the world, and this recording is going to be shared through Hope for Israel Alliance YouTube channel and our website and social media. And I'm guessing Professor Guiora will also share the recording with everybody else. We'll have it recorded. I do want to have kind of a last question addressed to you, as you said, the oldest person on this conversation, and I want to say maybe even the wisest. So what do you suggest each of us actually do as a first step to transition from being an enabler of anything that is ethically, morally wrong within the radius of our influence? And we can define radius of influence in various ways. What would you suggest we do?
So I begin with humor, right? I define myself as a youthful 67. Let's begin with that. I think it's pretty simple. Act. There's a really interesting, again, because I'm the oldest here. Back in the day when President Nixon was president of the United States of America, he used the term the silent majority. And he used that in a particular political context in the 68, 72 elections. As Yotam knows, right, the goal in Israel is to have 1 million people marching. That's the goal. There was, last Saturday, there were 700, 750. It'd be great if there were 1 million. And I think in terms of people here, the word begins with A and ends with a T, and that's act. And I know that, on Sundays there are in the United States, there are demonstrations here, demonstrations there. It's critical to be involved. And this is not the time for apathy or for the comfort of sitting in your living room. Is it fun on Saturday nights to go out and demonstrate and to be, yelled at, swore at, attacked? No, it's not. Or to be threatened with arrest. Some people have been like, I've been threatened with arrest. Is it fun? No, it's not. Can I sit at home? No. I think to your question, Sean, there's no plan B here. And again, I speak, probably as an Israeli because I live there. We don't have the comfort of not acting. And I think that is many ways where this begins and this is where it ends. Listen, my 4-year-old granddaughter is out there protesting because of my daughter. Absolutely. And that I use that as a model. Totally. Again, ask Yotam, Kif, look, option, no. And I behoove those who are in a position to act, to support. Again, I never tell people how to support, but to support the various organizations that are out there leading the fight. There've been sometimes, at Kaplan we hear about various organizations that are, supporting. I think that's beyond important. It's not important, not in context of heartwarming, but it's important practically to know that there's a sense that the recognition, realization that there is nothing more important than the hostages. Full stop.
Thank you for that. Specifically, if we're referring to people who don't live in Israel, acting to support the hostages would mean, I know what it would mean for me. What would it mean to others? So they do that switch from being an enabler.
I think that for me, and I referenced earlier, again, I never met Hirsch, but because of the thing about Hapoel Yerushalayim, the basketball, hostage families need to know that people are with them. I mean, I spent 2 minutes with Einav. I mean, there's nothing you can say other than, there's nothing you can say, but they need to know that. But let me finish with this, maybe, Sean. Yeah, I don't know how much play this gets in America. There's vileness directed at the hostage families by members of some members of the Israeli population. If you don't know this, they have been the targets of some physical attacks. They've been the target, and now received a death threat last week. I don't know if you were there then. There was a rally in support of the hostage families in Tel Aviv 5 weeks ago. I was there. The vile that was directed at me when I was walking to the hostage families, I'll spare the audience the vile, but the vile was vile. And people need to know that's also part of the Israeli scene at the moment. And there's I don't remember her name, I apologize. The woman who's my age or so, who was a hostage, she stands on street corners with signs. She's been attacked. And, and I think it's important that she knows that people are with her. And I don't know how the hell you send a death threat to Einav last week. He was arrested, which is a good thing, but it's out there. It's absolutely out there. By the way, Shawn and Tom, I've made a decision in my book to include the direct language with which people are speaking. I think it's important for the reader to understand the degree of the verbal violence, which I will spare your distinguished audience by putting it in the book.
We appreciate
Tom hears it also.
Yeah, everyone who goes out there and faces out there, either on the streets, even in safe North America, we get that kind of criticism, and sometimes foul criticism. So
sure, I've also been what do you call the water cannon, right?
Water
yeah,
cannon.
Absolutely. Oh. But
it blew off all your hair.
Hey, listen, it's no fun, but it's the price you pay for it's the fight. It's the price. Maybe that's the answer to your question. That's the price you pay.
That's the price you pay for democracy and for the values you stand for.
Absolutely.
Amos, I want to thank you immensely.
Thank you
for this wonderful opportunity. And Yotam, do you want to add anything else?
No, again, thank you, Amos, for
thank
joining
you
us and for the conversation.
And yeah, thank you everyone who attended. We appreciate your input, your questions, and we will keep you all posted on our next endeavor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.